I like to have fun on this channel. Fewer things make the time and effort I put into my videos worth it, quite like getting to talk about stuff I enjoy, even if it's not always the most conventional, or the most algorithm-friendly. To be a content creator might be mostly about making a shameless grab for ad revenue, but there's still that creative element. And while negativity certainly sells on the internet, it's not something I come by easily. If I genuinely don't like something, you're probably just never going to see me talk about it at all. With that said, however, in the world of Fire Emblem there is one subject that's been known to get me a little salty. And that's the Fódlan games. Because my god do people love to argue about these things. And I've been around in this fandom since well before 2019, so suffice it to say this setting gives me war flashbacks. I spent over 15 minutes of one of my videos last year rambling on about exactly that. If there's ever something Fire Emblem related that's liable to get me going into full-on rants, it's 3 Houses and 3 Hopes, because, in spite of how much I love aspects of both of these games, the fandom is a noxious cesspit. And I'm self-aware enough to know that both as a blogger and a YouTuber, I'm a part of that as well. So, in the spirit of embracing a rare moment of negativity, I'm here listing off the 10 Fódlan characters that bore, annoy, and/or outright frustrate me the most. I don't really have any notable parameters going into this, save one. I will only be considering characters who are playable in at least one of the 2 Fódlan games. Otherwise, a good third of this list would just be various Agarthans, because they are practically the definition of style and no substance. And when your style mostly consists of Tron lines and ballistic missiles and Kronya's that, I'm not exactly impressed over here. Other than that, though, everything else is on the table. Story, supports, relationships with other characters, and also gameplay sometimes, though knowing me, that's not going to come up much. Of course, this is my list, composed of my subjective opinions, and you are free to vehemently disagree with any or all of my takes down in the comments. Such is the nature of the internet. As a non-student character not named Byleth, Cyril already suffers from a lack of story presence and fewer supports, leading to the perception that he's not as interesting as all those significantly more marketable students that 3 Houses front-loads onto you. But there are a fair number of Fódlan characters that I find just kind of boring, so what gets Cyril onto this list is the missed opportunity. He's got some solid material to work with, being the only playable Almiran character other than Claude, who offers an interesting perspective on how little the leader of the Golden Deer actually knows about the lives of the Almiran people. And he doesn't like being used as a prop in political arguments, which is pretty funny, honestly. Also ironic, because Cyril's character tends to either be ignored or massively contorted in fandom, since as an Almiran who's unwaveringly loyal to Rhea, his existence presents complications for the endless faction wars. And we all know that internet wars of any sort are where nuance goes to die. But then the developers of 3 Hopes also looked at Cyril and decided they didn't feel like dealing with that. So in the spin-off, he's demoted from playable character status and just sort of hangs around in the base of Azure Gleam and gets mowed down in the other 2 routes because he's still loyal to Rhea, obviously, even if she herself is barely even in Hopes. Cyril would have some genuinely complicated feelings about the heir to the Almiran throne going all in on murdering his benefactor in the name of his own political ambitions. But 3 Hopes doesn't have room for something like that. You were done so dirty, Cyril. Of all the characters in this ranking, he's the only one I feel bad about placing here. At first, I was going to stick Raphael in one of these lower slots. People love to criticize Awakening, Fates, and Engage for gimmick character writing. That is, giving a character 1 or 2 surface-level traits and making 90% of their dialogue revolve around only those things. If you ever need proof that 3 Houses is not immune to the same type of gimmick writing, just point to Raphael. He has 2 traits, eating and training, and that's all there is to him. However, he just skirted landing on this list because Hopes redeems him a little bit with a rather sweet Ashe support, as well as his Felix support, which features an innuendo about fisting Dimitri. And the world could always use more of that. So I'm going to throw Raphael's friend-zoning BFF up here instead. Ignatz is one of several Fódlan character types that makes a lot of sense in a school story. The kid following the reliable but boring path laid out for him by his parents, even though what he really wants is to be an artist. However, that archetype doesn't translate all that well into a war story like what Fire Emblem usually is, and as a result, Ignatz can get kind of weird once you're out of the Academy stuff. Hey, anybody remember spring of 2019 when the fandom was worried that the game looked too much like Persona with all the school stuff and barely resembled a Fire Emblem game? Or how the Academy accounts for like 80% of Three Houses' legacy and supplementary material? Because I sure do. Anyway, Ignatz isn't the only student character like that. Or even the most egregious, really. Not when Linhardt, the brilliant but lazy nerd with hemophobia who realistically wouldn't go anywhere near a war zone, exists. But Ignatz is landing up here for his aforementioned contribution to the stultifying heterosexuality of the Golden Deer, which I will weigh more heavily than it perhaps deserves because it's my list, damn it. Hilda's practically carrying the house on her back here. Alois is but one of several boring filler characters in House's roster, like Hanneman or Gilbert. And apparently the devs felt the same because they all got cut from Hopes. But Alois takes my prize, or the opposite of a prize, I guess, because of one extremely petty detail. I really hate the game Dream Daddy, and Alois is the spirit of that most underwhelming and borderline offensive of gay dating sims distilled into a Fire Emblem character. By that I mean his dialogue primarily consists of unfunny dad jokes. And even though he's an S-rank option for both genders of Byleth, the game doesn't really let you go there because he's already married. With all the other off-color options available in this franchise, you're telling me that IS draws the line at adultery? Sure, Gilbert's got the same problem, but at least he's supposed to be humorless. Hell, I'll even go ahead and say one nice thing about Dream Daddy in that it actually allows you to have an adulterous hookup. Only to later wag its finger at you in a supposed good ending over how that was a naughty thing you did. The bar is really on the floor with this one. As an established connoisseur of gay dating sims, I cannot in good conscience have anything nice to say about a guy who reminds me of the most undeservedly well-known title in that genre. Incidentally, if you're into dating sims but haven't explored much beyond Dream Daddy, please do yourself a favor and do so. I have recommendations, whether you're looking for a stronger story, or better humor, or more diverse and better handled representation, or actual hardcore fun stuff. Seriously, Dream Daddy sucks. Somewhat in the same vein of disappointing daddies, there's Lester's biggest letdown, Holst. Three Houses built him up to be this towering figure of the Alliance, one that can make a pompous stick in the mud like Lorenz giddy with anticipation at the thought of getting commended to him. Even the hetero-flexible king of grappling might have a yes-no, maybe-so homo thing going on with Holst on the down low. He might be chronically off-screen like various other Houses NPCs, but he's undoubtedly one that we were all hoping to meet in some future project. And then, that exact thing happened, and it turns out Holst is just really boring. Part of the problem is how few support lines he has, but he even squanders the ones he gets by making most of his personality about being an overprotective brother, which, historically speaking, can go to some weird places in Fire Emblem, but Three Hopes has no character endings at all, so it's not like there's any chance of that happening. He can't even support Lorenz, and whether with Balthus or anyone else, he's just as much of a dud in the gay subtext department as one would expect looking at the rest of the Golden Deer. Caspar and Linhardt's dads managed to outdo him on that score, and they're still just NPCs. Monica is in sort of the same boat as Holst. She kind of exists in Three Houses, albeit as a body-snatched corpse, but we only properly get to meet her in Three Hopes. And while she comes with a larger story presence than Holst does, she's also another victim of gimmick character writing. What's worse, however, and what cements her place as one of my least liked characters in these games, is that her gimmick is one long joke about her unrequited lesbian attraction. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Within the very same games, I can come up with multiple examples of writing that handle similar topics with more finesse. Shamir's attraction to women is occasionally a source of humor, but the joke is never at her expense. Both Dedue and Catherine come with loads of homo-romantic subtext directed at their respective lieges, but outside of that one Dimmy-Doo meme in Houses, both of these situations are played completely straight, pun intended. Hubert is also defined by his unrequited attraction to Edelgard, and yet he's vastly more entertaining because he's like if Manfroy was a bisexual nice guy who's out to conquer the world even though it'll never get him laid. And then Monica comes along and steps on his turf even though she's also not getting any, and that's supposed to be funny, I guess? Speaking as a Dimmy-Doo shipper, part of their appeal is that there's a balance to their unhealthy codependency and cheesy one-liners. These two can, and do, fall apart without each other, and that's just kind of hot, especially knowing that they do manage to eke out a happy ending for themselves here and there depending on the game and route. That is very much not the case with Monica. Edelgard doesn't seem to understand her attraction at all. Dorothea is rightfully a little creeped out by some of her antics, and Shez is obviously a non-starter for all the usual Avatar reasons, and also how Hopes doesn't have any actual endings. Edelgard tells Monica to her face that she would have willingly sacrificed her if that would have been the better strategic move, something that we see go down exactly like that in Houses, and yet Monica's not offended by that and is still as into Edelgard as she always is. How can you even take that seriously? Sorry to say it, but Hubert did the very same joke, and he did it first, and he did it better. On the subject of subpar knockoffs, back during House's pre-release, everyone was dubbing Geralt a knockoff Grail. More than 5 years and one playable appearance later, yeah, that still about sums it up. To be fair, around half of what makes Geralt feel like such a discount version of a character we'd seen before over a decade prior comes from the weird way that these games handle Byleth. You can't really have an emotional arc about a dead dad when the child in question is incapable of emoting, or speaking for that matter. And as for the dying part, that's standard practice in Fire Emblem, so that's not really the fault of the Fódlan games either. It very much is their fault that there's never really a solid reason in story why Geralt is killed off when he is, as well as that his death is promptly dropped as a story element 2 chapters later because, again, Byleth is no Ike, and Three Houses isn't really about them or their daddy issues anyway. And then Three Hopes comes along and Geralt gets to die in 3 entirely new ways, and he's still not actually plot relevant in any meaningful or logical way, because this time Byleth themselves is barely in the story, so obviously their father fares even worse. All of that wouldn't put him on this list, however, because if Geralt was just a bit role handled awkwardly by the writing, he'd be only one of like a dozen characters who could say the same. But when you actually take the time to look at Geralt, he's kind of awful. He's an irresponsible alcoholic who raised his kid in a bubble, apparently just abandoned them for a while to go train Leonie, and then later on abandoned her, and then in some of Leonie's endings, she gets saddled with his posthumous bar tabs and even takes up his alcoholism. That's dark. Why does everybody idolize this guy again? Now sure, I can enjoy a sloppy character. I adore Manuela, and she's the textbook definition of a hot mess. But Geralt's not even funny about his sloppiness. You do not want to wind up in bed with him, sweetie. He's just made of red flags. So, interesting to note, Three Hopes is doing terribly today. The only new addition to its normal roster that didn't make it onto this list is Rodrigue, and I consider him to be more inoffensively boring than anything else. But yeah, coming up near the top, we've got the face of the spin-off themselves, Shez. A lot of us had high hopes for Shez when the game first came out. They can actually speak, and have something resembling a personality, even if it's not a terribly interesting one. They're also inducted into the academy as a student rather than as a teacher, so if that mildly kinky angle to Byleth's romance options never sat well with you, then here's sort of an alternative. Shez even comes with a mysterious backstory to be exposited on. It's just a shame that never really happens because Three Hopes is allergic to ending anything properly. And I might as well lump in Arval here too, because they're basically a package deal of missed opportunities. In Arval's case, that was the chance to write a sympathetic, multi-dimensional Agarthan character. But nah, it's just a split personality / reincarnation situation, so we don't actually have to deal with Arval being actively malicious. And that's part of the problem with both of them. Although Shez is introduced as the protagonist and is, apparently, the catalyst for the continuity divergence from Houses, ignoring that Chapter 1 all but states that had already happened because there's no Flame Emperor now, but it's still never really their story. Their rivalry with Byleth, and Arval's drive to kill Sothis, are mere sidebars in this turf war between enemy nations. They pop in and out of the story every few chapters, only to resolve it in an optional climax that by its design cannot influence the ongoing story in any way, or even vary much according to which story is being told, as demonstrated most painfully with how the Azure Gleam version has to dance around Edelgard's brainwashing. None of this can really matter, and so neither do Shez and Arval when you get down to it. Add that onto all the usual Avatar problems, and yeah, not a fan.
I'm not ready! Ambush! I knew you were out to get me! Stop! Put me down! I can't do this anymore! It's horrible! No! Someone free poor Bernie from this torment! I thought we were already serious! No! I don't want to die! Let me live!
That might only capture the surface level essence of what I feel about Bernadetta, but it ties into other issues well enough. And this is not a criticism of the voice actor, by the way. I've really enjoyed Erica Mendez in some of her other roles, and it's obvious that with Bernadetta, she understood the assignment. It's just that the assignment in question involved a lot of screaming. There's a reason that Bernadetta is a prime example of how Fire Emblem's support system arbitrarily limits character development, because all these comedic panic bits really highlight how often she's learning the very same lessons about being less anxious and opening up to people over and over again. And there's no real way to fix that, because trying to establish continuity across support lines would be a logistical nightmare. However, in her case, it's physically grating to listen to. And there's also the matter of, well, you know how when you watch the camera zooming in on Camilla's naughty bits? Or you notice that Sothis doesn't wear shoes? Or that this random, unnecessary upskirt shot exists? And you draw the reasonable conclusion that these design choices are intended to excite certain players in very specific ways? That's kind of Bernadetta in a nutshell the longer you look at her. You can try to dress it up as the extreme invert thing, or social anxiety, but come on, look at her S-rank CG, or at her hairstyle in Three Hopes, or at this shot of her doing an O-face, or, all that screaming and running away and how the player is the reason she can be confident and go out, which leads into, again, that S-rank CG. And you know why she's all wide-eyed and staring up at the camera there. I'm not usually one to knock what other people are into, but it is irritating when this is so in your face. And when you go online and see people defending the way Bernadetta is presented because of how allegedly well she depicts social anxiety. And I can't help but think that, at one point the writing parallels her behavior with Yuritsa's compulsion to commit murder, right? Or that Marianne exists in the same games and is handled much more seriously as she grapples with many of the same issues. If Bernadetta is your Blorbo, that's fine, but she's very much not mine. And I can't look at her, or at some of her heroes' alts, without it sticking in my mind just how much she's intended for an audience that is not me. how I dislike Yuritsa. Let me count the ways, starting from the pettiest and working my way forward. First off, that voice acting.
If you need something, spit it out. My ice cream is melting.
I may not be the biggest fan of Patrick Seitz, but he does voice certain types of characters well. Yuritsa is very much not one of those. And that's especially bizarre because Seitz was one of the voice directors in both of these localizations, and yet he turns in easily the most awkward performance. I understand that the point was to make the Death Knight voice sound intimidating, but he sounds exactly the same as Yuritsa minus the modulation, and it just doesn't work. He comes off as catatonic, which kills my ability to take him seriously in basically any of his dialogue. And worse, we know the direction was there. Dmitri has something like 4 distinct voices depending on which part of the story he's in. But Yuritsa just comes off as phoned in by comparison. Moving on, there's the matter of how bad Yuritsa is from a 100% completion perspective. I fully realize that no one on Earth cares about houses 100% except me, but this is my video, so I'm going to rant about it for a minute. Yuritsa is the closest thing to a Gota character in FE16, although the Gota archetype runs contrary to House's unique design philosophy of building your army from the ground up. He's locked to the last third of the shortest route in the game, alongside 2 other characters locked to the same route who are made worse by having to share playtime with him, and it's incredibly difficult to build him as anything too far outside of his base kit. Maxing out Yuritsa's Faith rank, with a Bane and that awful availability and that spell list, is the stuff of nightmares. And largely because of him, there's this snowballing effect in Crimson Flower where its lack of chapters compared to the other routes compounds the negative traits of every unit forced to be used in it. Obviously, this isn't an issue if you play literally any other way, and it doesn't apply to 3 Hopes because the parameters for 100% and New Game Plus are totally different in that game. But in Houses, Yuritsa is a massive pain in my ass, and not in the fun way. But while we're on that topic, I want to go back and clarify a point I made in a previous video that got some negative feedback in the comments. I still stand by my assertion that Yuritsa is straight. However, I realize in hindsight that I missed something in making that assertion. It is true, as stated, that Yuritsa has no supports with male characters other than avatars, who come with these standard avatar gender issues that I've also talked about in past videos. What I neglected to emphasize, though, was that Yuritsa does have a conventional romantic support line and paired ending with Constance, one that's remarkably ordinary considering we're talking about a compulsive murderer and a woman whose personality changes depending on whether or not she's in the sun. So yeah, Yuritsa's into women, and I also stand by my previous conclusion that his Byleth supports make it unclear whether he can differentiate between sex and violent murder when it comes to the self-insert, which could be hot in some contexts, but much like his voice acting, it's just not working here. And if that is what you're calling solid gay representation, I don't really even know what to tell you. And before we're done, I want to revisit one of the numerous plot points in Houses that everyone forgets about because it's just so weird, and 90% of it happens off-screen. In Chapter 6, Yuritsa goes on a date with Manuela, gets her flirty enough to where she steals his mask and runs off with it, then tracks her down and non-fatally stabs her and arranges her unconscious body in such a way that it's pointing toward the secret passage that the bad guys want to be found. This has no significant follow-up after this point, aside from an awkward alternate continuity version in the form of their support line in Hopes, but the whole time I'm replaying through this scenario, I'm stuck wondering how in the world did any of this go down? Was Hubert standing just off camera the whole time with cue cards telling Yuritsa how not to be utterly weird on a date, and then later how not to stab Manuela to death, and also to not kill Flame while he was kidnapping her because, again, compulsive murderer? I just feel so bad for Hubert in that case, face-palming over his incompetent co-workers. You'd think, too, that Hopes would rectify that since the two of them get a paralogue, but nah, they barely interact. That about sums up all my feelings on Yuritsa. Anything he does, Hubert does substantially better. He's funnier, he's not awkwardly guilt-ridden, he actually owns up to his evil. He's more of a credit to the Manfroy role than Yuritsa is to being a knockoff Zelgius. He's way more blasé about murdering his own father. And to top it all off, he comes off as more authentically bisexual because the one guy he's into isn't a self-insert. But anyway, before I get into my top, or rather bottom pick, let's get a couple of dishonorable mentions out of the way first. Does anyone even remember that Anna is playable in Three Houses? It's an easy mistake to make, since she's got no supports, no story presence except for a single paralogue, and no personality that we haven't seen from her every other appearance. It's a bit of a shame too, because this Anna comes with a unique crest that corresponds to the first of the major arcana in tarot, which could potentially have been interesting if, anything had ever been done with it. IS can't be bothered to remember Fódlan Anna either, since she's been left out of the family reunion in the Engage credits, and Engage Anna jumped the line and showed up in Heroes first. Anna's gimmick was already getting stale when Three Houses released, and these games did her no favors. On the other hand, Gatekeeper is a Fódlan original who's never been anything more than a walking meme.
Greetings, Professor. Nothing to report.
Seriously, there's multiple meme formats that sum up Gatekeeper's entire existence. And yet, this one-note NPC got boosted up to a victory in Choose Your Legends, then rode that wave of unexpected popularity all the way to an appearance as an unlockable playable character in Three Hopes. There's still nothing to report about him, though. If we're talking nameless NPCs who guard stuff, I'll take the Abyss Keeper and his on-again, off-again romance with Mr. Backup over his Surface counterpart any day. But anyway, now it's time to talk about my least favorite character in the Fódlan games. Though here I use the word character very loosely. When was the last time I've had a reason to complain about avatars? Oh, right, several points earlier in this video. Never mind. You all saw this coming. If I were only talking about Three Houses here, I could probably get away with dumping Byleth into the dishonorable mentions, on the grounds that they barely qualify as a character in the first place, even by Avatar standards. But then Hopes had to go and kinda sort of take them out of the self-insert role, so here we are. If you've played literally any other Fire Emblem game aside from Houses, you'll understand why this franchise doesn't do silent protagonists. It's just too dialogue-heavy and character-driven for that. It's bad enough that the amnesiac or extremely sheltered player proxy routine that all avatars do comes off as unnatural and out of place in comparison to even the blandest of lords, since those guys are at least grounded in their world on the same level as the rest of the cast. But Byleth takes it a step further by having no voice or emotions, and for some reason requiring an absurdly nonsensical backstory to justify that, making them a stillborn zombie related around 4 different ways to one of the game's headlining waifus. You can still romance her, of course, which I kind of have to give props to IS for just because of how over-the-top weird it is. It also just leads into very strange story elements. How does Crimson Flower's ending cutscene even work, with Sothis' Creststone disappearing for no apparent reason, but Byleth is still alive, and also you can still S-rank Sothis, and also, even though Rhea dies after the credits roll in Verdant Wind and sometimes in Silver Snow, Byleth's hair doesn't revert back to its original color in those routes. People love to rag on Fates and Engage for having nonsensical plot points, but don't make the mistake of believing that Houses is immune to that same kind of nonsense. And forget anything about a character arc for Byleth. The only thing that comes close is the merger with Sothis, which is an active downgrade because from that point onward we don't get to hear her snarky reactions to the plot, and instead just have to watch the self-insert stare blankly ahead as all these grandiose story events happen around them. I will never understand why people try to make a big deal out of Rhea supposedly wanting to erase Byleth's personality, because what personality? The only reason I can see for this is that it comes from players who believe that Rhea somehow intends to intrude upon the agency they projected onto Byleth. And considering they just merged with a goddess in the previous chapter and are still fine and playable, that was obviously never on the table. Come on, you presumably spent money on this game. Were the devs of a story this pandering honestly ever going to do anything to even remotely disrupt your power fantasy? And going back to Three Hopes now, if you dislike how none of that game's roots have proper conclusions, or that the characters don't get endings, or that the supposed main character's story arc is nothing but an awkwardly handled side piece, that's all on the devs' desires to not conflict with the self-insert fantasy from Houses, even though Byleth is barely even in this game. Their substantial impact on the final chapters of Scarlet Blaze doesn't make an ounce of sense, except sort of on the meta level of trying to clumsily imitate the Eagles' root split in Houses. And while removing Byleth from the Avatar role allows them to finally have a voice, it only underscores just how difficult they are to parse as a character that exists in this world in the same way as all the others, and not as some bizarre vestigial remnant of an artificially integrated game mechanic from a completely different title. I'm not going to pretend that both of these games' stories don't have a bunch of problems independent of how they handle Byleth, but their presence doesn't help matters at all. What's especially painful is that I can almost envision an alternate version of Three Houses where Byleth either doesn't exist at all or is merely an ordinary character and recruitable teacher, and that places the house leaders in the controllable protagonist role in the vein of standard Fire Emblem lords. And while it would take a fair amount of story adjusting and wouldn't be as popular because I'm well aware that the Avatar fantasy helps sell these games, pretty much every major character and storyline would have been improved without Byleth there dragging them all down. Dimitri would be even gayer than he is in canon, so kind of like Azure Gleam, only if it actually ended. Claude would be less of a cipher because his story would be told from his perspective, and Edelgard wouldn't have to have so much of her character pivot around self-insert romance marketability. And Rhea might have actually gotten to be playable in that scenario, and imagine what an improvement that would have been. All this is why I think that Byleth is the worst character in these games, a conclusion that I'm sure no one saw coming. I don't think that really even qualifies as a hot take either, since dragging Byleth for pretty much everything I said about them is fairly common regardless of where you lie within the interminable faction wars of the Fódlan fandom. It's definitely less controversial than placing any of the house leaders or Rhea on this list, which you'll notice that I didn't, because in spite of the behavior of certain fans I've had to deal with over the years, I don't dislike any of those characters enough to have landed them here. Controversy for its own sake, while it might be great for the algorithm, just isn't that fun for me. Now here's the part where I ask you which Fódlan characters you don't like. Go ahead and list those off down in the comments. I'd especially be interested to hear about any you might have aside from the usual discourse targets, because the leads have all been argued over to death already. Thanks for sticking along in this rare bout of pure negativity. This isn't something I plan to do often, but there can be something cathartic about breaking out the salt every now and then. Au revoir.